My name is Brian Dillon and you're here in Ballycloven. We moved down here 20 years ago to this two-storey farmhouse and really looking forward to showing you around to show you what we've been doing with the place in the last 2 decades. Okay, so you're welcome to Ballycloven. I'll give you a little bit of a walk around. Bobby. So when we came here, this paddock was completely full of nettles and brambles. So we've kind of converted it into a food growing area and lots of different explorations with fruit trees and fruit bushes and orchards and polytunnels and some outdoor crops as well, and hens. Yeah, so it's been kind of, I suppose, two decades in the making. It's taken that long. I'll show you through it. Yeah, let's look at the fruit first. So I suppose this is kind of a little bit like a food forest in a temperate climate. You've got lots of different fruit trees, and then you've got an understory of fruit bushes like currants, and there's some gooseberries here. There is rhubarb here, which has died back. These are briar fruits, so there's a row of jostaberries and boysenberries, and this plant here is there's berries are gone at the moment, apart from this one. This one is a Japanese wineberry. There's still some fruit coming on it. A lot of these were hit badly by the frost earlier this year. The flowers got kind of frozen off, so they didn't actually produce this year. I tried that. I tried fleece, but it didn't really work. In fact, it may have caused more damage because the fleece was wet and draped over the plants, and the fleece probably froze itself. So it might have been better just to leave it off and let the air prevent the frost from setting in. There's a couple of grapevines here, which we can talk about later. I'm trying a lot of different grape varieties just to see what you can produce, what you can get a crop out of in Kilkenny. So then coming around here, some apple trees and different types of blackcurrant bushes. Yeah. Some pear trees here, and there's various herbs, although it doesn't really look like it. There's some mints and spearmints around the bottom of the trees. Okay, we'll go into the first tunnel. Mind your head. We've got comfrey going here, which is kind of an essential crop for organic growers, and you use it as a fertilizer. So you can put it you can compost it directly, or you can chop it up and bury it in the ground, or you can make a tea. What most gardeners would do is they'd cut it down and put it all into a bin, and it would produce this thick black liquid, which you can then dilute in water and use to feed your crops. And you'd cut it down to the ground maybe 3 times a year, so you get about 3 crops out of it. You can't eat it, but it's a great. Pardon?
How are you multiplying?
Oh, you just dig up the roots. I can give you some before you go.
I drew my first bit.
Yeah.
This year, so.
Yeah, and they're also a fantastic pollinator. If you leave some of them go, they produce these spires of purple flowers, and the bees absolutely adore those. Yeah.
So you cut up the roots and just spread them
if you want to propagate it, you just dig up the plant and divide the root and plant it again. You don't use the roots, although I haven't heard of using the roots as a fertilizer.
Yeah.
You just use the leaves. If you crack it up and smell it, you can get this kind of, I don't know. You get this kind of fertilizer. I don't know. Smells like there's something good in it anyway. Yeah, this little tunnel here is actually maybe 18 years old, believe it or not. It's really lasted well because we're quite sheltered here from the wind, and it was our first tunnel. There's still lots going on. So, yeah, we're just coming up to the beginning of October. There's still plenty going on in this tunnel. There's some squash plants here which we've planted in after the strawberries. So this is actually a bed of strawberries, but as much as possible I try and get more than one crop out of a particular bed. So there's strawberries here in the spring, and then put in some squash, and maybe there's a courgette plant in there as well. So you can get a second crop out of the same bed. There's about 6 of them in there, of this squash. And down here we have, this is the second crop in this bed. There was potatoes in before it, early potatoes, which came out in early June. And then put in carrots and beetroots and cucumbers. So there's some nice cucumbers coming here finally. Yeah, they're actually a Vietnamese variety. I got some seeds just as an experiment, just to try out a couple of different varieties. Yeah, we do. I can show you that here. This is again. This is the second crop that's gone in here. There's the tomatoes, which we've been harvesting as we go, making a lot of sauce. There's some spinach which I just planted a few weeks ago, and there's some beans at the back which are just need to be harvested. And then there's this. So we have this watering system, but I do prefer to water by can. I usually mainly because it gives you a good opportunity to see what's going on. So I prefer so I really just have this watering system when I'm not here, and it's just these are kind of porous pipes. It's not ideal. I managed to get it at a very good price. It's not as good as a drip system, but it does get water into the bed, and the water just kind of, if it's on, you will see it just sort of seeping out into the soil.
Do you have hard water here?
Pardon?
Do you have hard water here with lime?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So it's from our own well,
Yeah.
and it's pumped.
No, I just heard that you'd have problems with the porous pipes. With hard water.
Well, yeah, you can see that they are actually becoming. They need to be replaced. They are actually deteriorating over the years, but it's fine for when we're away, So here's some beans, and as well as eating them when they're ripe, we also just let a lot of them dry out and then store them. So there's some beans, or you could save them for next year. So yeah, it's a good way of storing beans, is just to let them dry out, and then you can store them for months in some jars. Okay. And yeah, so the small tunnel was so successful that we decided we put in a big tunnel. So this was our second tunnel here. There's a lot more going on in here. I'll talk you through it. Okay. So just on the watering system, yeah, there is some porous piping if we're not here, but I prefer just to water with buckets because it gives me an opportunity just to see what's going on. We have these bins which are filled automatically. There's a ball cock there. So, and the reason for that is twofold. First of all, it saves going over and back to the tap and waiting for it to fill up. So you can just dump it in. All right, Bobby. And away you go. So it's much quicker, but also more importantly is that the water is already warm. So you're not giving, especially in the spring, you're not giving the plants a shock by pouring freezing cold water from the well on top of them. And then another benefit of that is that it becomes a kind of a thermal mass. So in the spring, in the cold nights, if you have big bins of water, they'll heat up during the day and then they'll disperse the heat at night, so it can keep the frost out of the tunnel. And you can use that technique by putting like buckets of water or even just, you know, cans full of water in amongst your sensitive plants, and it'll keep the frost away from them a little bit, just a little bit of protection. Yeah, so here we are. There's lots going on here. As you can see, there's tomatoes, there's basil and herbs. We've got some kohlrabi coming here. Will I just talk you through the plants? Yeah, this kohlrabi is amazing crop, really fast, very tasty, like a white turnip. Chives, parsley. This bed was recently planted, maybe only in July, so there's beetroots, second crop of French beans. So this is probably the third crop of French beans. So if you're going to try and provide for food, you know, over the year, you've got to keep planting. You know, you've got to keep planting crops throughout the year so that you have a succession. So in this bed, there's French beans and two different types of beetroot. And there's carrots, and there's quite a few weeds. And some welcome weeds like dill. Okay. Then in this bed there were potatoes, and now there's different types of squash, and some aubergines coming as well. They're beginning to suffer now with the cold nights, but we'll still get a few. There was a lot more, but we'll still get a few. The squashes behind you are almost ready to be harvested and, you know, brought into the house for winter storage. There's a few more here. There's another big one. Yeah. Chilies. Yeah, I let quite a few things go to seed. This is a particular type of salad which is really tasty. It's like a spinach actually, and it just self-seeds every year. So often, like with the dill that I just had there, what I would do is in the autumn is I would take off the seeds and just sprinkle them about the place and they'll come up next year. So as kind of welcome, you know, as welcome plants, you know.
Did the same thing with mustard in Polytunnel.
Yeah.
Mustard's great. And
Yeah,
it just comes up year after year.
Yeah, mustard. Yeah, I would use mustard quite a bit as a green manure. So when these crops are finished, I'll direct sow, broadcast sow some mustard seed, and that will grow over the winter. Not very much, but it will keep the moisture in the soil and prevent weeds from growing, and then you can dig it back into the bed in the spring. and yeah, it's a good thing to, rather than leaving the soil exposed and drying out. Then in this bed again, this is a second crop, so some tomatoes, but they're quite late. You know, these were actually plants that extra plants that didn't make it into the ground until quite late, and they won't produce an awful lot. It's too late for those flowers to produce anything. But anyway, I hate throwing out plants, so it was nice to get them in somewhere. But there's coriander here, some rocket at the back, and there's some. This is a winter green, an oriental green. I think it's mustard in the snow. I can't remember what it is actually. Again, here we have a crop of beans. So I usually grow the runner beans on a trellis like this. A lot of people use a string, which is, you know, really good if you're putting in a lot of plants. But if you're just putting in, you know, enough for a small family, I think it's nice to put them on these on canes, either bamboo or hazel rods, and it makes it easier to pick them because they're hanging down at an angle, so it's easier to harvest the beans when they're ready. When they've dried out like this, of course, you can see them. And again, I'm just gonna in a few weeks' time, I'm gonna harvest these beans and put them through the dryer and keep them for next year. Wasn't so many in that pod. Yeah, and up here, in the last bed again, it's tomatoes. It's yeah, excellent. It was a great year for tomatoes, and yeah, there was lots of sauce to be made for next year. In this bed, there's also basil, and there's a few different herbs that I was experimenting with. Behind there, this is all looking a little bit overgrown. It's kind of embarrassing. But that's actually a peach tree, and it produces incredible peaches. An incredible blossom, beautiful blossom. They would blossom in February, one of the first fruit trees to blossom, and then the peaches would be ripe in August, through August into September. So they need to be heavily pruned. They've been in there about 6 years, perhaps. That's kind of this tunnel. What else about this tunnel? The ground in the tunnel is just chipped wood, and I find that really good at preventing slugs. You know, they really don't like coming in here and having to travel across this dry material. And it's quite attractive to look at. Yeah.
What kind of compost mix do you use in your beds? Is it just a standard compost mix?
Yeah, I'll show you the compost bins. Yeah, well, I would compost all the kitchen waste and all the, all the plants, the grass, some grass, as much as I can. Yeah, but I would also add some soil amendments, like I'd be putting in chicken manure pellets, and I don't get that scientific about the soil. Like, I'm not testing possibly something that I might explore is to actually test the soil for, what nutrients are there, what nutrients are lacking, and then maybe make an amendment. But can't really see myself getting that scientific about it. I think you get a feel sometimes for what seems to be working for you. Yeah. But yeah, if I was preparing a fresh bed, I'd be putting in compost from the compost bins, and maybe some chicken manure pellets around the tomato plants and the heavy feeders. Yeah, the liquid seaweed I would use quite a bit. I'd put a little dollop of liquid seaweed in here before I water, or maybe if the comfrey liquid was ready, I'd put that in here. And then we've been working through our onions, but that table was full of onions. this is the propagation table. So there's all the trays here. I grow everything in modules, which I find really, really effective than direct sowing. So, and this table is heated electrically. So there's an electric coil under there, and a thermostat here. And so in the spring, this table will be completely full of these trays. And I would grow everything in modules. Start them off because you get ahead of the weeds, and then you can space out your plants in your beds nice and neatly. You know where everything is. So I'd be bringing on all the. I would start. These would be for salads and basil and tomato plants, and then they would, once they're big enough, I would pot them on into bigger pots like this, the tomatoes, and then when they're about that big, then they'll go into the beds. So it's very busy in here in the springtime. Yeah. Later in the season, you can direct sow because you're not up against the frost. So, for example, that bed there was largely all the French beans were direct sown in there. The beetroots and the beetroots were grown in modules first. In fact, even the carrots were. Carrots are one plant that actually don't really like starting in modules, but it can be. They just end up kind of squat and they kind of branch out and are kind of slightly disfigured. But if you don't mind that, it's fine. It's a fine way to do it. Yeah, I built the table. Yeah.
Like with the coil, like.
Yeah, that's just this red wire here. You can get it in any electrical shop. You know, they'd use it to prevent frost. In plumbers would use it to prevent frost in sensitive areas. They just wrap it around the pipes, and there's a thermostat, so it turns it on and off so that it gets the right temperature. It just needs to be about like 15 degrees really, or less, to prevent the frost from getting the young plants on the table. And I would cover it in fleece as well, in on the hard nights. Yeah, and I just have it under that sand there, yeah, it works a treat. It just saves a lot of disappointment if plants get damaged by the frosts. You can't see it right now, but around the edges there needs to be weeded. But around the edges, there's tomato plants in through the ground, bark mulch into the soil. So there'll be, sorry, not tomato plants, strawberry plants. So there'll be strawberries along there in May. Underneath that is actually, there's a weed block as well. I don't know if you can see it. I can't actually get down to it, but there's that black Mypex weed block underneath that as well. Doesn't stop them, mind you. Yeah. I'd highly recommend tunnels because it's just, you can just have a lot more success with your vegetable growing than growing in outdoor conditions. Like they protect against the frost, as I mentioned, but also the wind, birds, hens. If you have hens, and you're growing outside, you've got to cover them so they can't get into a tunnel.
Do you utilize your hens for fertilisation in the tunnels in the winter?
I have done, yeah. I would let them in when everything's gone, and they'll dig it up and nestle down into the dry soil, and they'll be pooping in there. So, yeah. But if I clean out the hen house, I'll put that manure through the compost, and then into the beds afterwards. Yeah, but they love coming in here. They'd be straight in if they saw the door open. Especially the brassicas, they'll just tear them to bits. Yeah. Tunnels definitely are, really fantastic place, and they're a lovely place to be. You know, they're warm, they're dry. You know, it's a lovely place to be, even just to just do a bit of work or just to sit down in the winter. But there is a little bit of outdoor gardening, outdoor vegetable growing going on. I'll show you that. And there's another tunnel I have to show you. Yeah, it's not. So the conditions here, the first few years, we actually had quite a lot of disappointment trying to grow vegetables outdoors, which is why we kind of moved to tunnels. But only this year I've started to grow a lot more vegetables outside. So that's where all those onions came from. And there's a quantity of leeks there. And then there's a couple of trellises of French beans, but they were blown over. So there's an example of wind damage. So these arches of climbing beans was damaged in the recent winds. So you avoid that in a tunnel. Certain things though you kind of won't perform well in a tunnel, such as leeks. They'll just go too leggy. And brassicas are better outside. In a tunnel, plants tend to bolt very quickly in the warm conditions, and they tend to grow very tall. So there's kind of limitations to it as well. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get crops from it, but they'll be quite big and difficult to manage. So another crop that was in here earlier was this was all broad beans earlier, so they're all in the freezer now. But they would tend to bolt a lot in a polytunnel. They'd grow too tall and not enough pods. Behind me there is just a couple of different compost bins, 4 compost bins. And I just know in my mind which is the one that needs to go into the tunnel next. We stick a flag into the one that's currently in use for the households to put their vegetable waste. It doesn't always work out, so it works. I'm not hugely scientific about that either, I'm afraid to say. I don't actually turn them as often as I should, but it works.
That marrow then.
Is there a marrow there? Oh yeah. There was a courgette plant in between the beans. Yeah, so that's the other thing is about maximising the use of your space, and I would do that especially in the tunnels. So you might try and plant as catch crops, so that if you had a bed with courgette plants in it, for example, they take up an awful lot of space. So what you would do is when the courgette plants are young, you'd be cropping maybe spinach or radishes or some salad before the courgette plant sort of takes over. So you can kind of intercrop as much as you can.
Do you kind of look into what plants are compatible with one another, or do you just kind of wing it?
Yeah, a little bit. I did study a lot of that in the early days, but I suppose I just kind of have a feel for it now. I mean, like a good example would be planting French beans under the climbing squash plants. So the French beans would be nitrogen fixing, and so they would benefit the cucumbers or the squash plants, and then beetroot seems to be a good companion plant in that mix. Like you saw in the small tunnel, there's cucumbers, beetroots, carrots and French beans in the same bed, so they're kind of all beneficial. And I do keep in mind crop rotation, so I won't be planting the same thing in the same bed every year, but I wouldn't be terribly scientific about it, it can be hard to remember from year to year what you've put in each bed. unless you had a diary. A diary, I suppose, would be quite useful. But I just, for example, in this bed, I know that the leeks were here last year. So they're going to go down there this year, and then they'll go over there next year. I just have it in my head. There was broad beans in this bed before. You can see that they're growing up from the roots, or it's possibly one of the seeds that yeah, they're definitely the seeds. But this probably is coming up from the original plant, and that's a classic technique. Would be to grow broad beans, which would give you a crop of broad beans and fix nitrogen in the soil, and then after they've finished, take them out and put in a brassica plant, which will benefit from the nitrogen that was fixed in the soil. And I also would have put some compost into the soil. The netting, of course, is to prevent the butterfly from laying its eggs. That's really with brassicas. I've just come to finally realise that the main thing is to get them covered as quickly as possible, so you don't get butterflies laying their eggs. And they also suffer from wind damage. As you can see, there's a little bit of wind damage there. But I'll take this netting off now in probably in a few weeks. Yeah, and I wouldn't attempt outdoors now. I wouldn't attempt to grow salads, because they'll just be hammered by slugs and chickens. They'd have to be in the tunnel, or those tender crops. Climbing beans do quite well outside, but French beans, tender French beans would be hammered by slugs for sure. So they would be a crop definitely for the tunnel.
Did that late frost cause much destruction?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it was really bad this year. You can see the apple trees behind us here, and they damaged the blossom. There was a terrible frost on the 12th of May, and it knocked out most of our apple blossom here. It also completely hammered these grapevines, so they're not going to produce any grapes this year. In fact, all those shoots have come up since the 12th of May. They were like that before the 12th of May, and then they were completely frozen off. But the plants kind of recovered, but they certainly won't produce any berries this year. I tried fleece, but it didn't work. I think the best thing with grapes, as you'll see in a minute, is either to have them in a tunnel or up against a wall. Yeah, in this climate. I attempted lighting fires. I lit a couple of fires here that night. The idea is that the fire will create an air circulation pattern in the orchard, which will prevent the frost from setting in. Some people say it's the smoke. I don't quite understand that. I can understand that if you have an air circulation pattern, it will prevent the frost from setting in on the ground. But it didn't actually work, so maybe you need really, really big fires. Like they used to light big fires in orchards in the old days to prevent frosts. A better thing would be a giant fan, and I have to admit that I did use a fan in the tunnel to prevent frost on grapes, and it really, really worked. I looked up recently online that you can actually buy these monstrous fans, like mounted on the back of tractors, like huge things, for orchards. They use it quite often in New Zealand. If there's danger of frost, they'll put these huge fans into the orchard, which will just blow air, not warm air, just blow air across. But that's a bit extreme for a domestic setup. So yeah, the orchard here, and there's lots of different varieties from Seed Savers. Mainly there's Beauty of Bath and Sam Young, and there's a Peasgood Nonsuch there. Then there's some other more traditional varieties like Discovery, Beauty of Bath. There's Newton Wonder, Golden Russet. There's a Kilkenny Pearmain over there. Unfortunately, not a big crop this year, but usually more than we can cope with.
What would be your main produce from the apples this
So apples, yeah. Well, I do a lot of different things with the apples. I would, apart from just eating them raw, we would dry them, so dehydrate them, and then they'll store in for over the winter. And nice alternative to snack, lovely snack, just dried apple. Then obviously I would juice them, and I would freeze some of the juice. I've also just in the last couple of years I've started pasteurizing the juice and storing it in bottles rather than taking up the freezer, and that works really well. I mean, you are losing something when you pasteurize, but it's kind of handier to have them in these pint bottles, and you can just take them off the shelf and drink them, as opposed to having to remember to take it out of the freezer and wait for it to defrost. It's just more convenient, and it looks great. Like, to have them all up on the shelf, it makes you feel like you're prepared for the winter. Then I've also turned the juice, of course, into cider. Tried different varieties, single variety ciders, just to see which works better. And yeah, that's always fun to do. And then you can let the cider go on into vinegar, which I think is probably a really useful thing to make. It takes, like, the best vinegar is produced from a good cider. So you produce the cider in the first year, and then you leave off the airlock and leave it exposed to the air, and after another year or 6 months it'll be vinegar. And then you can use that to preserve your beetroots and chutneys and so on. And good organic apple cider vinegar is quite expensive, so it's a really useful product to actually make. And once you have 1 or 2 demijohns of cider on the go, you always have it. 2 years sounds like a long time, but once you have it, then, and you keep doing it, then it's always available to you. Yeah. Okay.
Have a look at the other tunnel.
Yeah. We'll go by the pond though.
Hopefully that's going into compost.
It is, yeah. There's some runner beans. Yeah, there's more comfrey here. Yeah, it was probably put into the compost, the leaves, and so a bit of root probably went in with it, and now it's spread outside the compost bins. Okay, you'll have to bend down coming through here now. This one is a Kilkenny Permain variety from Seed Savers. It's about 5 years old, this tree. It's a little bit congested here. So there is actually a pond here, but it's a very dry summer. We'll go out onto the island. There's a little island in the middle of the pond. My God. Yeah, it's very overgrown. I'm afraid we didn't get to this year. But we have had ducks here in the past, and a couple of moorhens have nested here. And it's great for, just for diversity. We've even started to see some red squirrels in the garden in recent weeks. Margaret saw some red squirrels. Yeah. The bulrushes are lovely. I love those plants. Okay. Okay, so there's one more tunnel just to show you a few. Just on that, it seems a bit extravagant to have so many tunnels, but you know, it was either extend it was the existing tunnel or put up a new one, and it's kind of the same cost really, because it's just, you know, you still have to get the bars and the extra plastic, and there's an advantage to having separate tunnels, because you can separate your crops, and you're also reducing the risk of disease just in one tunnel, so you can isolate if you've got some disease or too much mildew or something in one tunnel. So it kind of makes sense to have a number of smaller tunnels in one big tunnel, at least in this context. So in this tunnel, I suppose the main thing at the moment is we have this grapevine, which has been in about 6, maybe 7 years. 2 grapevines actually, a black one and a white one. And yeah, they're doing quite well this year. There's
Has it always produced this much fruit?
no, well, in the last 3 years it has produced this much fruit. So I'll make juice out of the black ones and pasteurize it, but I will make wine out of the white ones. I've done that before. It worked really well actually.
Nice.
I did a rosé from the black ones one year, but it wasn't great. They don't tend to be getting as sweet as the white ones.
How long were they in the ground before they started to fruit?
About the vines themselves, they're probably about 7, maybe 8 years old. Yeah, there's a whole, growing grapes is a whole kind of universe of thought and practice, you know. What I do is that I have these spurs. I prune it all back to spurs every year, which are about 2 feet, well, about 1.5 feet apart. Spur, 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 spur. So they'll be right cut back to that. So it'll just look like there'll just be a vine with all these kind of like little spurs sticking off them every 2 feet. And then each year they'll send out new shoots with grapes on them, hopefully. And they say that grapes, you'll only get a really good harvest of grapes on wood that was grown the previous year. So you cut back, you leave some of this new wood, and that wood. So I'll cut there and there and there. So and then you'll get 3 new shoots growing off that next year. But they'll try and shoot everywhere anyway, so you kind of have to keep on top of them. And you can see that all the leaves have been cut. And I'm not sure if that was a great idea, but the problem with grapes in a tunnel is ventilation, and they'll get this thing called botrytis. There's a couple of diseases on these grapes, I'm afraid. This is the botrytis, which is kind of like a mildew there. You can see it there. It's quite ugly, although if you read some of the wine books, they say that you can let some varieties do that and even then go and make wine from them, and they come up with an interesting flavour, a nice flavour, surprisingly. But the thing is to have ventilation so that that doesn't happen. These also have a disease called leatherberry, which happens sometimes. But there's still plenty of good ones here, so we'll get a good crop of juice. The other reason to take off the leaves, of course, is to let light into the beds under here. So there's chard, and there's black kale, Russian kale, there's parsley, there's some kohlrabi in there, as well as some tomatoes. So
Wow.
it's another seed table.
Those courgettes.
Yeah, don't know what to do with them. Okay, it's a bit of a mess here, but there's courgettes here that are finished and they're turning into marrows, and that's actually a bed of for pink apple potatoes, which need to be harvested. So it might seem a bit strange to put potatoes in a tunnel, but I find it works really well. They do grow very tall and leggy and a bit difficult to manage, but then the soil doesn't get as wet, you know, in July, and I find that they don't get as much disease then. So they might have a smaller amount of tubers, but there won't be any that are diseased or rotten in the ground. They'll all come out perfectly dry because the soil here is slightly elevated, I suppose. That works for me anyway. Even we tried some rhubarb in the tunnel, which was probably a bit crazy, but we get a very early crop of rhubarb, which is nice. Okay. Right. So maybe we just look at some of the fruit trees growing up against the walls and then go down to the wood.
That'd be great.
Yeah, okay. The hen run is there. She must be out somewhere. So what I've really tried to, capitalize on all the wall space that we have here in terms of growing fruit crops. And not just your south-facing walls, but also the east and west-facing walls, because they retain the heat. They heat up during the day from the sun, and then they let it off slowly at night, so that the plants, you can prevent the frost, but also helps with ripening, and the plants they do a lot better. So this is a young red currant bush here. It's only 2 years, but over here you can see the pear tree, which is, it's probably only 6-7 years old, but it produces a great crop of pears, and that's south facing. It's probably the only way you'll get a good crop of pears in Ireland, I think, is to grow it up against a wall and to espalier it like that, or that's in a fan. This is a grape crop. It's a wine grape. Very nice. It's only in a few years, so I suspect next year there'll be enough to make a small quantity of wine. They're supposed to be that small. It's a particular variety.
Yeah, that's the one that I have.
All right,
Wondering
yeah.
why they're so small.
Yeah, no, this one is Triumph d'Alsace. It's supposed to be that small. It's particular for wine, and there's again, in the winter I'll cut that all back to about 5 spurs, and then there's more pears here on the east facing wall. Pears. This is a young plum tree here. Been fan pruned up the south facing wall. When we came here, we were lucky enough that the farm building came with a couple of acres, and we decided that the best thing to do would be to plant a mixed broadleaf woodland, and it's amazing how quickly it's grown and how mature it seems, like a forest, and we've already seen an increase in wildlife, hedgehogs, and we've seen some red squirrels recently. So it's really cool. In this part of the garden, there's a young orchard started. Not that we need more apples, but there are different varieties of native Irish apple trees that we're trying out. Okay. So this area that we're walking through now was a grass field up until about maybe 15 years ago. And there's a mix of birch and cherry, Prunus avium cherry, some oak, mountain ash, hazels, sycamore, lime, we tried to do log mushrooms last year, but it didn't work out, unfortunately. I might try it again. So these are oak logs, and what you do is you drill them out, and then you hammer in these little wooden dowels that have been impregnated with mushroom spore for shiitake mushrooms. But it didn't work out, I'm sorry to say. I think they dried out. I think you have to be on top of keeping them dry, or keeping them moist. Sure, I'll try it again. It looks pretty. So yeah, so this woodland here is, I mean, it's a beautiful space just to have a stroll in. So the intention of the woodland was to supply the log boiler, but I'm kind of reluctant to do that. It's such a pretty space to be in. So we're just using, you know, the thinnings at the moment in the stove, and also we have to cut down the bit of ash that's planted here because it's infected with the dieback. So this is all ash that is really badly infected. It was actually planted a little bit too close together as well, but it's mainly got this ash dieback disease, which is really upsetting to see in Ireland. It affects the younger trees first, but it's moving on to the more mature trees. And it's really going to transform the countryside, especially in Kilkenny. And I don't think the councils have really woken up to it. Like, all the roads are lined with huge ash trees, which are going to start losing limbs and falling down in 5 years. It's quite shocking when you really sort of face up to it. And yeah, I just hope it doesn't spread to other species of trees. We can. Yeah. So, well, when we cut this down, we will probably just replant with another mix of species. So it shows you the importance of having a diversity of species. If one of them is going to fail, there'll be something else. It's been interesting as well just to see what different types of understory develop in under different kinds of trees. They're not the different species here. It's not completely random. There's sort of a section of birch and a section of hazel and a section of ash and a section of cherry, and it seems the most diverse seems to be under the hazel, and the cherry seems to have the best canopy for suppressing the grass. And yeah, it's interesting. See what's coming up. Cherries seem to self-seed very readily. This alder and mountain ash seem to be seeding themselves. We can go back this way.
When you were planting this, how did you keep the grass down? How did you get rid of the grass?
I didn't. No, I just well, there was cattle grazing for the first 2 years, and then I just planted in whips into the ground, and eventually they just suppressed the grass. You'll see some of the trees have. I don't see one right here, but some of the trees have a kind of a. Yeah, this one here. So a lot of the trees are like this. They're kind of a bent at the bottom, and that's because the grass would have been sort of leaning on the young whip, would have been bent over until it got strong enough to go straight up. So a lot of the trees are like that. So no, I didn't make any attempt to. There's enough grass to cut around the house. Yeah.
I'm over there like 3-year-old trees that we're putting in.
No, they're only 1-year-old whips. Yeah, about a
they're-
metre high. Yeah.
They're okay to compete with them.
Yeah, they were. Yeah. 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 I mean, yeah. As long as you plant them densely enough, you know, they'll form a canopy fairly quickly and then suppress the grass. You'll have, and then once they get to a certain height, then you're going to you'll start getting the brambles coming in then. And like this was a whole bed of brambles while the trees were younger. So then the trees had to, but then they suppressed them. So eventually there's a nice sort of forest floor forming and there's ferns appearing. And we've put in some spring bulbs as well, like bluebells and daffodils and so on. Right. So then we just have this is a bridle path just for the neighbours' horses. He runs his horses down to the field here. From the sheds. There they are. They'll come over now. Hiya. Maybe. We're normally here later. They're probably confused. Yeah. Yeah, you see the sallies there. I'm really worried about the sallies that have dieback. This here is a sign that the tree is stressed when they start sending out shoots from lower down. I don't know. I might ask some forestry guy if it's in the sally. Sally is a willow. Yeah. Beautiful day. There's Sleeve them on in the distance. So I won't go on about the ash dieback anymore, except to say that in about 3 years' time, all those trees you see there will be gone, or else there'll be skeletons covered in ivy. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know, maybe there needs to be a tree planting campaign to start planting other species and a diversity of species. You know, I mean, one of the reasons is it came in was that they were planting, you know, vast monocrops of ash.
Yeah, like that would be the problem, isn't it? Like if
there's a diversity.
If there was a diversity, it wouldn't be as bad for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, anytime you plant a monocrop, you're exposed to the risk of a disease.
Yeah,
I must say, I don't tire of it. I love seeing the plants come on in spring. You know, I love seeing this is some alder, or not alder, some spindleberries up there. It's a beautiful native tree, the spindle tree. It has these lovely pink seeds, and the leaves go this lovely colour at this time of year. Yeah, I love seeing the plants come on again from year to year. You know, I think this is, yeah. Don't tire of that anyway. Yeah. There's plenty of things that I do tire from, but it can be a bit overwhelming. This time of year is there's a couple of times a year when it's really busy, which is probably May and June, when nature is really in full throttle. You've to keep on top of it. But then you can kind of sit back in July and August, and then gets really busy in August, September if you want to process it all and get it into bottles and into the freezer or chutneys and all of that. Preserving is probably the biggest, you know, it's not that hard to grow the food, to be honest. It's the processing, you know, and the storage. That's hard going. You need to motivate yourself to do that, you know. But there's great pleasure in, like, we have a shelf shelves full of our own produce, which we know it's where it's from and it's all organic, and you know, yeah, brings it all together, I suppose, is because, well, there's a lot of food in the, there is a lot of food in the freezer, but we're trying to jar a lot as well. So there's apple juice and blackcurrant concentrate and some elderberry. This is the vinegar from 2 years ago. Apple juice. There's tomato sauce and pickled beetroots and courgette chutney and pickled beans and pears, rhubarb cordial, apple syrup, jams, some peaches. Then here's the beans from the tunnel, dried out and stored, probably over a year old, but still fine to cook and eat. Yeah, so yeah, that's really, growing food is, you know, is easy and fun. And okay, it takes a bit of work, but you know, really preserving it and storing it away is a big job too, but very pleasurable one for me. Yeah, just to see it all complete. Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks for showing your interest in the garden and what I've been doing here, and hope it's inspiring to some of the viewers. And yeah, get growing.